Somewhere in a French field, in the autumn of the year 1095, one man spoke for maybe an hour. And within months, tens of thousands of ordinary people, farmers, servants, the very poor, people who had never in their lives traveled further than the next market town, packed up what little they owned and started walking east. Not toward the next valley, toward a city almost 2,000 miles away. A city most of them could not have found on a map. A city many of them had only heard about in sermons. By the time it was over, nearly every single one of the ones who set out first was dead. Cut down on a hillside in a land they'd never seen. Killed by an enemy they didn't understand. The reasons that even now historians argue about. And the strangest part is this. The man who gave that speech never asked for any of that. He wanted a few hundred soldiers. What he got was a flood he could not stop, could not steer, and did not live long enough to fully understand. If stories like this one, the moment where a single decision slips loose and reshapes the whole world, are the reason you're here, then subscribe and give this video a like. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it means the next chapter of history I dig into lands in front of you. Now, let's go back to where the fuse was really lit, because it isn't where you think. To understand how a whole continent picked itself up and marched toward Jerusalem, you first have to understand just how violent and how crowded 11th-century Europe had become. Forget the calm, ordered picture of knights and castles you might carry in your head. Picture instead a landscape of feuding strongmen. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the centuries before, the areas that once answered to a central ruler had fragmented into hundreds of small counties and lordships. Local lords and knights fought each other constantly for control of every strip of land, every toll, every village. Think of a country where the central government simply stopped existing, and every man with a fortified house and a few armed followers became a law unto himself. In much of France, especially, violence wasn't an interruption of ordinary life. It was ordinary life. The feudal system had been built on the presumption of perpetual warfare. These were men raised from boyhood to fight. From the time they were children, sons of the knightly class were trained to bear the weight of armor, to throw a spear, to ride down an enemy. That was the entire point of them. And when there was no war to fight, they fought each other, over a strip of land, over an insult, over a disputed inheritance. Imagine a whole society engineered to produce men who were extremely good at killing, and then giving them nothing to do but kill each other. That's the pressure building across the continent. That's the steam with nowhere to go. The church, which was supposed to be the moral spine of this world, was in no position to lecture anyone. It had spent generations tangled up in its own corruption. Bishops who bought their offices like a man buys a horse. Priests who ignored every rule they were supposed to keep. The papacy itself was in chaos, locked in a decades-long power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over who actually ran the faith. Popes were driven out of Rome. Rival popes claimed the throne at the same time. It was a wreck. And so, out of sheer desperation, churchmen tried something. They invented what they called the peace of God. First proclaimed at councils in southern France, it sought to protect ecclesiastical property, agricultural resources, and unarmed clerics. The idea was almost naive in its ambition. If you couldn't stop the knights from fighting, maybe you could at least fence off the defenseless, the priests, the peasants, the women and children, and declare them off limits. It was a beautiful idea. It barely worked. You cannot simply ask a man who has been trained since childhood to solve every problem with a sword to suddenly put the sword away. But inside that failed experiment was a seed of something enormous. Because the churchmen kept circling back to a single question, one that would eventually change history. What if you didn't have to stop the violence at all? What if you could just point it somewhere else? These reformers were considering how knights could turn their aggression to pursuits that were useful to Christian society, rather than preying upon civilians. Redirect the flood. Aim the killing outward. Hold that thought. It's the whole story. And then there's the other side of this. Europe wasn't just violent, it was filling up. From the end of the 10th century onward, the population had begun to swell, and it kept swelling for 200 years. More people, more mouths, more younger sons of noble families who would inherit nothing, because the family land went to the eldest, and the rest got a horse, a sword, and their ambition. Think of a pressure cooker slowly building steam, with every year adding a little more heat and no valve to release it. A continent bursting with armed, landless, hungry young men looking for somewhere to go, something to do, some way to prove themselves and make their fortune. Now turn your eyes east, because that's where the spark was waiting. Far across the Mediterranean sat Constantinople, the capital of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman world that had never fallen. In this age, it was arguably the strongest, richest, most sophisticated state anywhere west of China. The empire controlled vast territories, commanded enormous wealth, and housed the most educated men in the Christian world. Its libraries held the inherited wisdom of 1,000 years. Compared to the muddy, fractured, feuding West, Constantinople was a different civilization entirely. A city of 100,000 people or more, of gold mosaics and running water and libraries, while a Western great lord might live in a drafty stone tower with a smoky fire and barely be able to read his own name. But this glittering empire had a wound. A few decades earlier, a new power had come storming out of the east. The Seljuk Turks, mounted warriors who fought in a way the Byzantines had never really learned to counter. At a place called Manzikert in the Armenian highlands, the Byzantine army had been shattered in a single catastrophic battle, and the emperor himself had been captured. In the years that followed, the Turks poured into Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, which had been the empire's heartland, its recruiting ground, its breadbasket. Imagine a nation losing, in the span of a few years, the single richest region it owned, the place that fed its cities and filled its armies. That was the hole punched in the side of Byzantium. Territory that had been Christian for centuries was gone. Onto that wounded throne climbed a soldier named Alexios. He'd seized power in a coup. The throne was a prize for the strong in those days, and the empire he inherited was, in the words of one contemporary account, being horribly ravaged in the east, while the west was in bad condition. He was cunning, patient, a master of playing enemies against one another. But he understood something crucial. He did not have enough men. His own manpower had been bled dry in that eastern disaster, so he did what Byzantine emperors had done for centuries when they were short of soldiers. He decided to hire some. And where do you hire tough, well-armored fighting men who have nothing better to do? You look west, to that seething continent full of landless knights spoiling for a war. Alexios sent word to the west, through envoys and quite possibly through formal letters, appealing for military help against the Turks. Now, here is where you have to hold two things in your mind at once, because this is the exact point where the story bends. The relationship between the Christian East and the Christian West was tense and prickly. The churches had split apart centuries earlier, and old wounds ran deep. But it had recently been thawing. So in the spring of that year, Byzantine envoys arrived at a church council in northern Italy and stood before the Pope himself, and they made their request. And I want to be careful and honest here, because historians still argue over the fine details. What we can say with confidence is that a call for military aid came from the east, delivered by Alexios' envoys, and it landed in front of exactly the right man at exactly the wrong moment. What Alexios wanted was almost embarrassingly modest by the standards of what followed. Alexios sought mercenary troops from the west to protect Constantinople and recover Anatolia from the Seljuk Turks. A professional force, hired swords, a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, seasoned Western knights to fight under his command and then, presumably, go home. He was asking for a scalpel. The man listening to those envoys was the Pope, a Frenchman who had taken the name Urban. And Urban was no wide-eyed idealist. He was a shrewd political operator with problems of his own. A papacy locked in a bitter, decades-long power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over who really ran the church. Urban looked at the Byzantine request and, I think, saw not just a plea for help but an opportunity. A chance to do several things at once that no pope had ever managed. And this is where a limited appeal from mercenaries began quietly transforming into something no one had a word for yet. Because Urban did something Alexios never asked him to do. He decided to take that request and reshape it into a mission for all of Western Christendom. After the council in Italy, Urban did something extraordinary for a pope of his age. He hit the road. He spent well over a year traveling through France, the first visit by a pope in a generation, winding through region after region, meeting bishops, holding local councils, laying the groundwork. Think of a modern political campaign, a candidate crossing a country town by town, building momentum, testing a message, gathering support before the big announcement. That's essentially what Urban was doing, except the stakes were higher than any election. And the announcement he was building toward would set fire to a continent. And in one sense, he had to be careful about how he framed it. The old wounds between East and West still ached. But Urban understood something the emperor in Constantinople did not. He understood that there were tens of thousands of men in the West who were not waiting to be hired. They were ready to be unleashed. They just needed permission and a target. It's worth saying plainly what many people don't realize. Urban had almost certainly discussed this in advance with the men he needed most. He'd talked it through with powerful bishops and with one of southern France's most important lords. This was not a man improvising. This was a man who had carefully arranged his stage before he ever stepped onto it. The stage was a town in central France called Clermont, where he'd called a council for late November of that year. On paper, the council was routine church business. Reform, discipline, punishing wayward clergy, extending the excommunication of the French king for casting off his wife and taking another man's. 10 days of ecclesiastical housekeeping. And then, on the final day, everything changed. There were so many people gathered that no building could hold them, so the Pope went outside, into an open field, and had a platform raised, and he climbed up in front of the crowd, and he began to speak. Stand in that field for a moment. It's late November, cold, a great mass of clerics and knights and ordinary townspeople pressed together in the open air, their breath fogging, straining to hear one man's voice carry across a crowd of thousands with no way to amplify it. Whatever he said next would echo for 1,000 years. Now, and this matters, no one wrote down his exact words as he spoke them. No contemporary stenographer, no direct record. Everything we have was reconstructed later, some of it years later, by men working from memory or from what they'd heard. 5 different accounts of the speech survive, and they vary in their details. The account by a man named Fulcher, who historians believe was actually present at the council, is generally considered the most reliable. So when you hear the dramatic lines, keep that grain of salt close. We don't know precisely what Urban said. We know what he set in motion. But the shape of the message comes through clearly across all the versions. Urban told the crowd of terrible things happening to Christians in the East, of churches defiled and pilgrims mistreated, of a fierce people who had overrun sacred lands. Some of this was true. Some of it he exaggerated, painting the Muslim threat in darker colors than the reality warranted. And then he made the offer that changed everything. He connected the whole thing back to the violence tearing France apart. And he told these feuding, quarreling, sword-happy warriors that there was now a better use for their skills. Let those who have been fighting their own brothers now go and fight the enemies of the faith. Let those who have been accustomed unjustly to wage private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels. Let those who have been robbers become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers now fight in a proper way against the enemies of Christ. Do you hear what he's doing? He's taking that old, failed dream of the peace movement, the idea of pointing the violence outward, and he's finally found the target. All that pent-up aggression, all those landless young men, all that machinery of war with nowhere to aim itself. He's giving it a direction. East. And then the masterstroke, the thing that turned a suggestion into a stampede. He promised that those who went, those who died on the way or in battle, would have their sins wiped clean. Urban promised immediate absolution to all who die either on the way or in battle against Muslims. Complete remission of sins. A clean slate. To understand why that single promise detonated the way it did, you have to inhabit the mind of an 11th-century warrior. This was a man who genuinely, bone-deep, believed in hell. A man who had killed, probably many times, and who lay awake at night terrified of what awaited his soul. And now, here was the Pope himself, the voice of God on earth, telling him that the very thing he was best at, fighting, could become the thing that saved him. It was as if you could take the worst, most dangerous part of yourself and, by pointing it in the right direction, transform it into a ticket to heaven. The response, by every account, was overwhelming. The chroniclers described the crowd erupting, bursting into a roar, a spontaneous cry that would become the battle chant of the whole enterprise. Robert, a monk who was there, gives a vivid account of the audience bursting into spontaneous cries of Deus vult, God wills it. Whether the crowd truly cried it out in one voice that cold afternoon, or whether it's a detail polished up by later writers who knew how the story ended, we can't be fully sure. But something happened in that field. Something caught. And here is where I'll be honest about what I find so remarkable in this whole story. Urban had lit a match, expecting a controlled flame. He wanted knights, trained, equipped, disciplined fighting men, to muster the following summer and march in an organized way to help the Christian East. He even set a specific departure date, well into the next year, and appointed a bishop to lead the whole thing. That was the plan. A pope's plan, sober and structured. But a message like that, once released, doesn't stay in the hands of the man who sent it. Urban rode on through France repeating his call, and other preachers picked it up and carried it into every town and village, and the message mutated as it spread, growing wilder and more urgent and more apocalyptic with every retelling. The Pope had expected the knights and nobles would go to provide military assistance to the Byzantine Empire, but the response was much wider than he had foreseen. Clerics, minor nobles, townspeople, and even peasants all vowed to go to Jerusalem. The poor began to hear that a crusade was coming, a pilgrimage to the Holy Land that offered salvation to anyone who made the journey. By the time the count of how many had answered was made, the numbers were staggering. Somewhere between 60 and 100,000 souls, from every layer of society. A pope had asked for an army. He'd summoned a migration. And in one sense, he had solved the puzzle the whole century had been struggling with. Take the endless, senseless violence of feudal Europe and aim it at something. But solving one problem this way created another that no one saw coming. Because Urban had assumed the great lords would lead, he'd assumed order. He'd assumed the trained knights would go first, in the following summer, under proper command. Long before those disciplined armies were even close to ready, before the great nobles had finished selling their estates and gathering their knights, a very different kind of force was already forming. Not lords in mail, not seasoned soldiers, but the poorest of the poor, the desperate and the devout, tens of thousands of ordinary men and women who heard the call and simply could not wait. They didn't have supplies. They didn't have weapons. They barely had a plan. What they had was a wandering preacher, a burning certainty that God was on their side, and a road that led east, toward a city none of them had ever seen. And they were about to start walking. They set out in the spring, months before any lord was ready, and from the very first day it was clear this was not an army. It was a migration of the desperate. Whole families walked out of their villages together, old men and small children among them, driving carts loaded with everything they owned, because they weren't going to a battle. They believed they were going to the end of the world, to Jerusalem itself, and they were never coming back. Contemporaries were astonished at the sight. One chronicler wrote that they were beyond counting, and that little children, seeing every town and castle along the way, asked whether this was Jerusalem, the place they were bound for. Picture that, a child on a dusty road in the Rhineland, pointing at some ordinary walled town and asking a parent, "Is that it? Is that the holy city?" They had no idea how far it was. They had no idea what waited for them. Most of what they thought they knew about the journey came from sermons and stories, not maps or solid information. At the head of the largest of these ragged columns walked a man who had become a legend in his own lifetime. He was a preacher, small and unwashed, who rode a donkey and went barefoot, dressed in a filthy woolen cloak that reached to his ankles. He ate almost nothing. No bread, a little fish, some wine. And he had a gift that in that overheated moment was more dangerous than any sword. He could move a crowd. Contemporaries said the people treated him as though he were holy, tearing hairs from his donkey to keep as relics. Think about that for a second. They were pulling hairs out of a donkey and keeping them as sacred objects because of the man who rode it. That is the temperature of the world we're dealing with. That is how ready these people were to believe in the sacred, to see God's hand in the ordinary, to surrender themselves to a cause larger than their own lives. By the time this preacher's column reached the Rhineland, it had swelled into a mass of thousands, and it was hungry, and it had no supplies and no discipline, and no idea how far Jerusalem really was. And it was here, in the prosperous cities along the Rhine, that the crusade committed its first great atrocity, one that had nothing to do with the East at all. The logic was as simple as it was monstrous. These crowds had been whipped into a fever over the enemies of Christ far away in Jerusalem, and some among them asked an obvious, terrible question. Why march 2,000 miles to fight the enemies of the faith when there were people right here in these very cities who in their eyes had rejected Christ? The Jewish communities of the Rhineland, old, established, prosperous communities living in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, suddenly found a mob at their gates. In the early summer of that year, a series of massacres swept through the Rhineland. Some crusaders offered a single choice: convert to Christianity or die. Many chose death. In Mainz, one of the largest Jewish communities in the region was destroyed, hundreds killed, some by the mob, and some in scenes recorded in horror by Jewish chroniclers, killing themselves and their own children rather than be forcibly baptized. Estimates for the number of Jews killed across the Rhineland that spring run into the thousands. And I want to be clear about something, because it matters. The Pope hadn't called for this. The local bishops in several cities actually tried to stop it, hiding Jewish families in their own palaces, and in some cases, the mobs broke in anyway and killed them. This wasn't the plan. This was what happens when you take tens of thousands of frightened, hungry, fanatical people, tell them they're on a holy war, hand them no real leadership and no supplies, and turn them loose on a continent. The violence Urban had hoped to aim eastward spilled out sideways, onto the nearest people it could reach. It was the first sign, and it would not be the last, that no one was actually in control of the thing they had unleashed. Then the columns moved on down the Danube, toward Constantinople, and now a new enemy took over: the road itself. These were not soldiers. They could not feed themselves. When the food ran out, they took it, raiding markets, stealing livestock, stripping the countryside as they passed. In Hungary and in the Balkans, this brought them into bloody clashes with local Christians, who had no interest in being robbed by a passing mob, and thousands died in skirmishes before they ever laid eyes on a single Turk. Imagine a swarm of 100,000 people descending on a region like locusts, eating everything, and the terrified locals fighting back with everything they had. That was the People's Crusade crossing Europe. Whole villages were emptied. Stores of grain meant for the winter were consumed. The Crusaders moved through the landscape like a plague. When the survivors finally staggered up to the walls of Constantinople, the Emperor Alexios must have looked out at them and felt his heart sink. He had asked for trained knights. What had arrived was a filthy, starving, undisciplined horde that was already looting his suburbs. He had them ferried across the water into Asia as fast as he possibly could, partly, one suspects, just to get them out of his city. And he gave them one piece of advice, urgent and specific: wait. Do not advance. Do not go looking for the enemy. Stay in your camp near the coast, keep together, and wait for the real armies, the knights who were coming behind you. Don't risk everything before the professionals arrive. They didn't wait. Camped on the edge of hostile territory, bored, hungry, and quarreling among themselves, the Crusaders split into factions. Raiding parties pushed inland, looking for plunder and glory, and they had some early success, enough to convince them the Turks were nothing to fear. That success was a trap. Word came back that one raiding party had taken a fortress. Rumor twisted it into a great victory. And so, against every warning, the whole mass of them, thousands of poorly armed men, leaving the sick and the old and the women in the camp, marched inland toward the enemy heartland. The Seljuk Turks were waiting. They knew the ground. They knew how to fight. Mounted archers who could ride and shoot, who could feign retreat and then wheel around and cut you to pieces. And in the wooded hills of Anatolia, a few miles from their camp, the Crusaders walked straight into an ambush. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Turkish horsemen fell on the column and simply destroyed it. One account describes arrows falling like rain. Those who ran were ridden down. The massacre spread back to the camp itself, where the Turks fell upon the defenseless, killing the men, taking the young and the pretty as slaves, cutting down the old and the sick. Of the tens of thousands who had followed that barefoot preacher out of Europe, only a remnant survived, huddled in a ruined fortress by the sea, until a Byzantine fleet came and took them off. The preacher himself lived because he happened to have gone back to Constantinople to complain about supplies, and so was not there when his followers died. He survived when nearly everyone else was gone. Sit with that for a moment. The first wave of the crusade, the poor, the devout, the ones who had believed most fervently, was gone. Wiped out before the actual war had even begun. Tens of thousands of people had walked 2,000 miles to die on a hillside in a land they never understood, killed by an enemy they never saw coming. And back in Europe, the men Urban had actually been counting on were only now getting ready to leave. Because the real crusade was a different animal entirely. This time it was the great lords, the men with the money, the men with the trained knights, the men who fought for a living. And what they did to answer the call tells you just how seriously they took it. Because going on crusade was not cheap. It was, for most of them, financially ruinous. A knight had to equip himself, feed his followers, buy horses, and pay for the journey, and the cost of going was several times a lord's annual income. So they did the only thing they could. They sold. They mortgaged their castles, sold or pledged their lands, liquidated whatever they had to raise the enormous sums required. One of the great leaders, a duke from the north, essentially pawned his entire duchy to raise the cash. Think of a wealthy family today selling the house, the cars, everything, and borrowing against what's left to fund a one-way trip into a war zone on the far side of the earth. That is the scale of the gamble these men were making, and many of them made it, never expecting to return. The commitment was staggering. It was also, in some ways, insane. There was no single king leading this. That's one of the things people get wrong. The great kings of Europe mostly stayed home. Some of them were excommunicated, some at war. None of them went. Instead, 4 separate great armies formed in different corners of the West, each under its own powerful lord, each taking its own route across Europe, all of them converging on one point: Constantinople. There was the army from the far north, led by that duke who'd pawned his lands, and by his brothers, practical, hard men from the Lorraine frontier, descended from the old nobility of the north. There was the great host from southern France, the largest of them all, led by an old, one-eyed count who had already been fighting Muslims for decades on the Spanish frontier, and who saw himself as the natural leader of the whole enterprise. There was the army from central and northern France, full of famous names and royal blood, knights descended from the old Frankish nobility. And there was the army from southern Italy, Norman warriors, the descendants of Vikings who had carved out a kingdom in the Mediterranean centuries before, led by an ambitious, ruthless prince and his even more ambitious nephew. These Normans had actually fought against the Byzantines in previous wars, and their presence now created a tension everyone could feel. Enemies yesterday, allies today, but with deep suspicion on both sides. And that awkwardness is the second half of this story. Because when these armies arrived at Constantinople, they walked straight into a wall of mutual suspicion. Put yourself in the emperor's position. Alexios had asked for mercenaries, soldiers he could hire, command, and control. Instead, over the winter, One great Western army after another rolled up outside his walls, each led by a proud, independent warlord with his own ambitions, and together they numbered far more fighting men than he could match. He had just watched the first wave of these Westerners loot his suburbs. And now the descendant of Vikings, who had personally invaded his empire a few years earlier, was camped outside his gates. The richest city in the Christian world sat there, like a jewel in front of men who had crossed a continent looking for glory and land. Alexios had every reason to be afraid. Fear made him dangerous. So he played the game he knew best. He would feed them and flatter them and dazzle them with the wealth of his city, and he would get them out and across into Asia as fast as he could. But first, he wanted something binding. He demanded that each of the great lords swear an oath to him, an oath of loyalty, and a promise that any city or land they took that had once belonged to the empire would be handed back to him. Some of the lords swore it grudgingly. One reportedly had to be starved into it, his supplies cut off until he agreed. The old count from southern France flatly refused to swear the full oath at all, agreeing only to a watered-down version. Beneath the ceremony and the gifts, both sides knew the truth. They didn't trust each other, and they never really would. That broken trust between the Western lords and the emperor would poison the whole crusade, and eventually, it would help pull the Christian world apart. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, Alexios got what he wanted. The armies crossed the water into Asia Minor, into hostile territory, and the war began in earnest. And almost immediately, the Westerners got the chance to prove they were nothing like the doomed rabble that had come before them. Their discipline, their armor, their training, these things mattered now. Their first target was a great fortified city that guarded the road inland, the former capital the Turks now held. The Crusaders surrounded it and settled in for a siege. And here, the strange dance with the Byzantines played out perfectly. As the Crusaders battered the walls, the emperor's agents secretly negotiated with the Turkish garrison, who quietly surrendered the city to the Byzantines to keep it out of Western hands. The Crusaders woke one morning to find the imperial banner already flying over the walls. They'd done the fighting. The emperor had taken the prize. It stung. It confirmed everything they'd suspected about him. But the road ahead was now open. The path inland was clear. They could move deeper into Turkish territory. Then came the real test. Marching inland across the barren plateau, the huge Crusader host had split into two columns to make it easier to find food and water. And the Turkish leader who had annihilated the People's Crusade saw his chance. He fell on the forward column at dawn near a place called Dorilaeum, and for a few hours it looked as though the whole crusade might die right there. The Turkish horsemen swarmed them, that terrifying tactic of galloping close, loosing a storm of arrows, and wheeling away before the heavy Western knights could close in. One eyewitness who was there wrote that they were all bunched together like sheep in a fold, trembling and frightened, surrounded on every side. Women in the camp carried water to the exhausted, fainting fighters. The knights, packed too tight to charge, could only hold and pray and die. Fear was winning. But the Westerners did one thing right. They held. They formed a defensive knot around the non-combatants and refused to break, hour after hour under the arrows, while a messenger raced to bring up the second column. And when that second army finally crested the hills and crashed into the Turkish flank and rear, everything changed in an instant. The Turks, caught between two forces of heavily armored Western cavalry, broke and fled. On open ground, once those armored knights could finally close the distance and bring their weight and their lances to bear, the lighter Turkish horsemen simply could not stand against them. It was a stunning, total victory. The Crusaders captured the enemy camp and its treasure, and for the first time, the Turks had learned to be afraid of these Westerners. The army that had destroyed the People's Crusade had been destroyed itself. It should have been the turning point where everything got easier. It wasn't. Because now the Crusade faced an enemy that no battle could defeat. An enemy that would kill more of them than every Turkish arrow combined. The land itself. The Turks had learned their lesson from Dorylaeum, and they changed tactics. They stopped fighting pitched battles. Instead, they retreated ahead of the Crusaders, and as they went, they destroyed everything. Poisoning wells, burning crops, driving off livestock, leaving nothing but scorched, empty ground for the advancing army to march through. And then the Crusaders had to cross the heart of Anatolia in the dead of summer. Imagine tens of thousands of men and animals, wrapped in wool and iron, dragging themselves across a sun-blasted plateau where the enemy had already burned away every scrap of food and fouled every source of water. The heat was the enemy now, not swords. The accounts of that march are almost unbearable to read. Men died of thirst on the road. So many horses died that knights, the proud, mounted warriors who defined this entire enterprise, were reduced to walking, or riding oxen, or loading their armor onto pack goats and dogs. Their war equipment was carried by sheep and dogs, one chronicler noted, and even the knights went on foot. The heavy horses that made a Western knight a knight simply dropped dead in the heat, and there was no way to replace them. Think of a modern army's tanks running out of fuel, one by one, in a desert with no supply line. Except these were living animals, and men watched them die and knew what it meant. The great fighting machine that had shattered the Turks at Dorylaeum was being quietly dismantled, not by an enemy, but by heat and hunger and distance. By the time the ragged, thirsty, half-starved army finally descended out of the mountains and back toward the fertile lands of the coast, they had lost thousands more men and most of their horses, and they had learned the brutal arithmetic of this crusade. The battles killed you fast, but the road killed you slowly, and the road killed far, far more. And ahead of them, blocking the way to Jerusalem, sat the thing that would test them beyond anything they had yet endured. A vast, ancient city, one of the greatest in the world, ringed by walls so massive and so studded with towers that no army could hope to storm them by force. Behind those walls, a well-supplied garrison. Around them, open country that a starving army would have to somehow feed itself from through the coming winter. The Crusaders had crossed a continent and a desert to reach it, and now they would have to sit down in front of those impossible walls and choose. Starve where they stood, or find some way through stone that had held for 1,000 years. Somewhere out beyond the horizon, Turkish armies were already gathering to relieve the city and crush the invaders against its gates. The great walls of Antioch were waiting, and everything the crusade had suffered so far was about to look like the easy part. The city did not fall. That's the first thing to understand about Antioch. The Crusaders arrived in the autumn, sat down in front of those enormous walls, and then simply could not take them. The defenses were so vast, miles of walls, hundreds of towers climbing up the mountainside behind the city, that the Crusaders didn't have enough men to surround the place completely. They could block some of the gates. They couldn't block them all. So the garrison inside kept a lifeline open to the countryside, and the two sides settled into a grinding stalemate as winter came down. And then the real enemy arrived. Not soldiers, hunger. The Crusaders had marched into this valley in autumn, and at first there was food. The surrounding country was rich, and they stripped it bare, feasting recklessly, as if the campaign were already won. That recklessness cost them everything. By midwinter, they had eaten the region empty, and there was nothing left. Then the rains came, and the cold, and the food ran out entirely. The accounts written by men who were there grow more desperate the longer the siege goes on. The price of food climbed until it was beyond reach. A single loaf, a single egg, costing sums a poor pilgrim could never pay. Men began to starve in the mud outside those walls. Watch what hunger does to an army. First, they ate the pack animals, the mules, the donkeys. Then the war horses, the precious, irreplaceable war horses that made a night a night. By the worst of that winter, one chronicler wrote, there were barely a few hundred fit horses left in the entire army, out of the many thousands they had started with. Think of an army losing almost all its vehicles, its mobility, the single thing that made it powerful, and eating them to survive one more week. When the horses were gone, they ate dogs and rats and the hides of animals and the seeds they scratched from the frozen dung of the fields and thistles that tore their swollen gums because there was no bread to soften them. And there were, in the accounts written by men who were there, even darker hints, whispers that some among the starving turned to eating the bodies of the dead. The starving died in numbers that dwarfed anything the Turks had done to them, and the effect on the army was worse than the deaths. The whole enterprise began to come apart. Men slipped away in the night and deserted, including, to the Crusaders' shame, some of their own leaders and famous men who abandoned the siege and fled for the coast. One important lord sneaked out and rowed toward the sea, abandoning the siege he'd helped to organize. That barefoot preacher who had led the doomed first wave, he was here too, and he tried to run and had to be dragged back. Discipline dissolved. The army that had shattered the Turks in open battle was now a shivering, skeletal thing, dying slowly in the winter mud. And the great walls of Antioch still stood, untouched, impossible. So how did they get in? Not through the walls, never through the walls. They got in through a man. Somewhere inside the city was an officer of the garrison, a commander responsible for a section of the walls and its towers. The sources don't fully agree on who he was or what turned him. Some say he had been badly treated, some that he was bribed, some that he simply saw which way the war was going. But over a series of secret messages, one of the Crusader leaders, that ambitious Norman prince from southern Italy, struck a private deal with him. The traitor would let the Crusaders in over his stretch of wall, in the dark. In exchange, the Norman wanted the city for himself.
Here the old poison came back to the surface.
The Norman refused to hand Antioch over to the emperor, refused to honor the oath he'd sworn at Constantinople, and forced the other leaders to agree that whoever got them into the city could keep it. Ambition, in the end, cracked the walls that hunger and siege engines never could. Personal pride, the unwillingness to be bound by an oath, the hunger for land and power. These emotions, as much as any battering ram, were the thing that brought Antioch down. On a dark night in early summer, after the siege had ground on for the better part of a year, a picked group of crusaders crept up to the base of the tower the traitor commanded. A rope or a ladder of hides came down from above. Stand at the bottom of that wall in the dark with them. The walls of Antioch are so high they seem to touch the stars, and you are climbing a swaying ladder in the black night, trusting your life to a stranger's promise, knowing that if the deal is false, or if a single sentry cries out, you die on the stones below. The first men went up.
The tower was theirs.
Then more towers, then a gate thrown open, and the Crusaders poured into the city and took it in a night of slaughter, killing the garrison and, in the frenzy, a great many of the city's Christian inhabitants too, in the dark, because no one could tell friend from enemy. They had the city, and that is precisely when the trap they had feared all along finally snapped shut. Because just days after the Crusaders took Antioch, the horizon filled with the thing they had dreaded. A massive Muslim army sent from Mosul to relieve the city, an army far larger than the starving, exhausted Crusaders could hope to match, arrived and laid siege to the very walls the Crusaders had just captured. The hunters had become the hunted. Now the Crusaders were inside the city, trapped, with the granaries already emptied by their own long siege and a huge, fresh army camped outside, cutting off any hope of resupply. The starvation began all over again. Worse this time, because now they were penned in. In a matter of days, they had gone from besiegers to besieged, and everyone in that city understood the arithmetic. They could not win a battle against that army in the open. They could not survive a siege inside a city with no food. They were, by every rational measure, finished. The game seemed over. And it was at this moment, the lowest, most hopeless point of the entire crusade, that the Crusaders found a reason to believe again. Or, depending on how you see it, invented one. A poor pilgrim in the army, a man of no rank, came to the leaders and claimed he had been visited in a series of visions. A saint had appeared to him and revealed a secret: that the Holy Lance, the very spear that a Roman soldier had thrust into the side of Christ on the cross, was buried right there beneath the floor of a church inside Antioch. Now, some of the leaders believed him instantly.
Others were deeply skeptical. One of the senior churchmen thought the whole thing was a fraud and pointed out, quite reasonably, that a lance already claimed as this same relic was known to exist in Constantinople, locked away in the emperor's vault. But it didn't matter what the skeptics thought. The starving, terrified army needed a miracle, and here one was being offered. Hope, even false hope, was more nourishing than food. They went into that church, and they dug. Picture the scene. Men on their knees in the dirt of a church floor, digging for hours, finding nothing, the hole getting deeper, the doubt growing, until finally the visionary himself jumped down into the pit and came up holding a piece of iron, a fragment of an old spearhead. And the cry went up that the Holy Lance had been found, and the news swept through the starving army like fire. And men who had been ready to lie down and die wept and shouted and believed, suddenly and totally, that God was with them after all. Whether that piece of iron was genuinely ancient, whether it had been planted there, whether the visionary was a holy man or a clever fraud, historians have argued it for 9 centuries and will never settle it. What is beyond dispute is what it did. It transformed broken, starving, defeated men back into soldiers willing to fight. And so they made a decision that, on paper, was insane. They would not wait to starve inside the walls. They would march out of the gates, onto the open plain, and give battle to the enemy that vastly outnumbered them. They were so short of horses that most of the knights had to fight on foot or ride mules and pack animals. They were weak with hunger. But early on a summer morning, they threw open the gates and marched out in ordered ranks. And they carried the Holy Lance at the front of the army, like a banner from heaven. Stand on the wall of Antioch and watch them go. Below you, a thin line of gaunt, ragged men on foot, walking out to meet a force that outnumbers them and could ride circles around them. It should have been another slaughter. It wasn't. The enemy army, it turned out, was divided against itself. Its commanders distrusted one another, and rival contingents held back or would not commit. The Crusaders, fighting with the wild energy of men who believed God himself was in their ranks, advanced in a solid line and did not break. And when the great Muslim army, riven by its own divisions, failed to coordinate its attack, it wavered, and then it broke. And then it fled, abandoning its camp and its supplies. The Crusaders, who days before had been eating rats and boiling leather, had won the most improbable victory of the entire war. Whatever you believe about that piece of iron, the thing it lit in those men was real enough to shatter an army. After Antioch, the road to Jerusalem was open. But they didn't take it, not right away. The leaders fell to quarreling over who would keep Antioch. The Norman prince took it and held it, oath to the emperor be damned. And the whole enterprise nearly tore itself apart over the spoils. For months they lingered, arguing, until it was the ordinary soldiers and the poor pilgrims, the ones who had actually come for Jerusalem and not for land, who finally forced the issue. They had buried their families on this road. They had eaten dogs. They wanted the holy city, and they threatened to march without their lords if they had to. Shamed and pressured, the leaders finally moved south. The campaign that had nearly died in front of Antioch was moving again. And in the summer, 3 years after that speech in a French field, the survivors of that vast host, now perhaps a tenth of the number who had set out, came at last within sight of the walls of Jerusalem. Men fell to their knees and wept at the sight of it. They had crossed a continent, a desert, and a mountain range, buried the overwhelming majority of everyone they had started with, and here it finally was, the city that had been on every tongue since Clermont. This was why they had come. This was the prize for everything they'd suffered. The city was strongly held and well supplied, and the Crusaders, once again, were in a desperate hurry. The land around Jerusalem was dry and barren, there was little water and less food, and they knew a relief army was already marching up from Egypt. They could not settle in for a long siege. They had to take it fast, or die of thirst in front of it. They built siege towers from timber hauled from miles away, and after a first assault failed, they threw everything into a final attack. In the middle of July, they got a siege tower up against the wall, and men fought their way across onto the ramparts, and the defenses broke, and the Crusaders poured into Jerusalem. What happened next, I'm going to tell you the way the eyewitnesses told it, without softening it and without dressing it up, because the men who did it recorded it themselves, and they were not ashamed. They thought it was glorious. The Crusaders massacred the inhabitants. Not the garrison, the inhabitants. One Crusader who was there wrote that his men rode in blood up to the knees and bridles of their horses. Another described piles of heads and hands and feet in the streets. They killed Muslims and Jews together. The Jews of the city had gathered in their synagogue, and it was burned. Men, women, and children. Accounts speak of tens of thousands dead, of streets choked with bodies, of the survivors, days later, being forced to drag the corpses out and burn them in heaps taller than houses because the city could not be lived in otherwise. This was victory. This was what the crusade had purchased with all that blood and suffering. And here is the detail I keep coming back to, the one that says the most. The chroniclers, who had described every hardship of the journey in loving, exhaustive detail, every hunger, every skirmish, every miracle, grow strangely brief when it comes to this. Some report the slaughter almost proudly and move on. Others simply fall quiet. There's a kind of silence in the sources at the moment of victory, a lack of words that tells you more than any number could.
These men had marched 2,000 miles, believing they were the instrument of God's will.
They took the holiest city in their world, and the record of the thing they had actually done there is, in places, just a blank, as if even they, in some corner of themselves, did not quite have the words. How do you celebrate victory when what you've done shames you? So they wrote it down and moved on. They built a kingdom on that conquest. The Crusaders carved the conquered coastline into a handful of Latin states, a kingdom of Jerusalem and its neighbors, a thin strip of Western Christendom clinging to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a 2,000-mile-long experiment in transplanting European lords, European castles, European law onto a land that was overwhelmingly not European and not Christian. Most of the survivors, having fulfilled their vow, simply went home. Only a fraction stayed to hold what they had taken. And that thin strip of a kingdom, born in that much blood, would last less than 200 years before it was slowly, inexorably taken back, city by city, until nothing of it remained. So let's go back to that cold field in France, and the man on his platform who thought he was asking for a few hundred mercenaries. Urban never saw any of this. He died 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell. Before the news could even reach him, he went to his grave not knowing that the thing he set in motion had actually succeeded. And I think that's the truest ending this story has, because the crusade was never really his, not after that first afternoon. He struck a match to solve a local problem. Too many violent men, too little for them to do. And the fire he lit burned across an entire continent and 100 years and hundreds of thousands of lives. And it went places he never imagined and did things he never sanctioned, from the massacres on the Rhine to the blood in the streets of Jerusalem. That's the thing about the moment a decision slips loose. You can light the fuse. You cannot choose where the fire goes, or who it burns, or how long it keeps burning after you're gone. Tens of thousands of ordinary people heard a promise on the wind and walked off the edge of their known world toward a city they'd never seen. And most of them died in the trying, frozen, starved, cut down, forgotten. They believed they were walking into paradise. What they walked into was one of the strangest and bloodiest chapters human beings ever wrote. And the marks it left, on the map, on the memory of 3 faiths, on the long, poisoned relationship between East and West, are still visible today, 900 years on, if you know where to look. The scars still run. This is why I keep digging into history. This is why these stories matter. A moment that seemed obvious and just in one age looks different in another. A call that felt righteous becomes a wound that won't close. And the people who answered that call, most of them poor, most of them desperate, most of them forgotten, they were the ones who paid the price. If you followed this story all the way here, then subscribe and stay with the channel. The past is full of moments like this one, where a single spark ran further than anyone could ever have imagined, and I want to keep telling you about them, one buried story at a time. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.